Hi everybody, in this video we're going to look at the rise of the Mongols and their impact in the beginning of their empire building, and we'll pick up on other effects of the Mongols later. So let's talk about the Mongolian Empire, how it spreads, and first let's talk about who the Mongols are. So the Mongols are a steppe nomadic tribe from just north of China, and you can see on this animated map that in less than 100 years, they spread to create the largest contiguous empire in world history. So we'll see that the British Empire is technically larger, but it's non-continuous or non-contiguous, whereas the Mongols' empire is all connected on land, and it gets pretty big, as we can see right there. So a little bit about Mongol culture before they rise to become the largest empire ever. First is that we need to recognize that the Mongols are a nomadic group of people, and still today many Mongolian people are kind of semi-nomadic. Some people live in some of the big cities, which there's only really one big city in Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar. So most people still live in a fully or semi-nomadic lifestyle. So they're retaining a lot of the traditions. They're a part of Mongolian life back in the 13th century or the 1200s. And so here we can see some Mongols who are just moving along, about to set up their mobile homes in a new location. The Mongols back then, and many still today, live in what are called yurts. So this is an illustration of what these yurts look like, and here are some Mongols in a cookout. But yurts are these like very elaborate mobile tents. And this is a modern day yurt, which looks pretty similar to what the Mongols in the 1200s would have lived in. So it's utilizing mobile materials that can be set up and broken down. So a heavy dependence on things like leather and canvas and rugs, as well as like wooden structures to hold it up. So this is what it looks like on the outside. This is an example of what a yurt can look like on the inside of what a yurt today in Mongolia would look like. So it can still be really comfy. Mongols today do travel with these wood-fired stoves, although in the past it would have been like just like a kind of an open fire that would have gone up through this center hole right here. So the importance of mobility, because as a steppe nomadic group, they are reliant on their horses. We'll take a look at their horses. And the way that they kind of make ends meet is through roving around based on where their animals can graze, as well as using their horses to participate in trade as transporters rather than craftspeople along trade routes or merchants. A couple other images is because mostly I think they're cool. So the Mongolians are kind of experts at falconry. We can see here a Mongolian person in traditional garb holding this falcon. Here's this, I think is the youngest Mongolian girl to reach a very high level of excellence in falconry, and I just think this is like such an incredible photograph here. So that are very ancient practices. Still today, people participate usually in the month of June and July in these historic games that the medieval Mongols would also play, which includes a lot of horse riding, a lot of archery skills, wrestling, and things like that. So there's a lot of retention of culture. When it comes to women in Mongol society, generally speaking, the pattern that we see is that the more nomadic and small scale the society, the more gender equal things are. And that also applies to the Mongols. However, we're going to see that the treatment of women isn't always so great. So I don't want to make this seem like it's some sort of like gender equal utopia, because it is not. But at a certain level, women did enjoy certain types of privileges in Mongolia that they didn't enjoy in places like China, we'll say. A great example of that is Genghis Khan, or really I should call him Chinggis Khan. His first wife, Borta, who's pictured here, was given a very high rank in his government. She served as a diplomat and an advisor. So showing that they did value women in that way. And so when the Mongols take over certain regions, we'll see it will temper some of the super patriarchal practices in some places for a short period of time, but it's not going to make any place very gender equal. So one bit of preview with their culture in that way. We're going to look at this together in class so we can enjoy it, but a really unique feature of Mongolian culture is something called Mongolian throat singing or Tuvan throat singing. You might have heard about it before. It's a pretty ancient practice where essentially there's overtone singing where there are multiple tones coming from one throat through a combination of techniques used to relax the throat and also to use your tongue and your mouth to create like different airways coming out of the mouth. The idea of this is to mimic nature and natural sounds. It's a pretty unique thing that people still play with today. So we'll watch this together in class. Other things that I want you to be aware of before we talk about the rise of the Mongolian Empire itself is that based in Mongolian culture, they had a lot of key military advantages that helped them take advantage of political vacuums and create their huge empire. So first is that they were able to amass a huge cavalry because there are so many horses in the Mongolian steppelands. There were more horses than there were people. And this is helpful because it meant that they could change out their horses when they were riding to take over places, and so they never had to slow down. Sometimes they would put fake dummies on top of their extra horses to make it look like their military was larger than it actually was. It's said that the Mongols only had fewer than as many people can fit in like a modern day stadium in their military, and yet they were able to take over the world. So having horses is a big part of that. They also had very light armor that protected them but allowed them to move because they utilized things like silk and leather, which are way more mobile than, like a heavy armored suit like the European knights would wear. They also utilized a compound bow, which we can see them using here. And I think I had a picture right there is the compound bow. So the compound bow is really important because it could shoot arrows even farther. And also the way that they rode horses allowed them to have more stability. So they're extremely accurate, with their compound bow. So they're excellent at that. They also had a very specific military strategy called the decimal strategy, in which every part of their military is broken down via decimal. So there were groups of 10, 100, and 1,000. And based on certain calls that they would make, they could break their army up based in that decimal system in strategic ways to kind of split off and like drive their enemies away, or to split off and kind of sneak up behind their enemies. And the idea is that you had to be loyal to what that decimal group was doing. If you broke off from your decimal group, they would kill the entire decimal group, not just you, but the whole group itself. So it led to a great deal of loyalty and submission to the general strategy, which helped them be successful. They also utilized biological warfare, and they would do this by staging these sieges where they would blockade a town for a period of time. They would always give a town or a whole kingdom the opportunity to surrender. And if they surrendered, they promised to not kill anyone, and they usually kept that promise. But if they didn't surrender, they would first blockade them to kind of starve out people and whatnot. Sometimes they might, if they had someone who was suffering from a very communicable disease like the plague, they would fly that diseased corpse over the wall of the town and wait for the disease to wreak havoc amongst the community, lower the population levels, and then take it over. So they utilize lots of strategies to take over the world, even though the Mongols themselves had a small military. So just some more images of the Mongols and some of the armor that they'd had. So a lot of leather armor in this drawing. And then this is a little Mongol horse. I just think they're really cute. They're very small statured horses, which is a huge advantage for the Mongols because the lower to the ground, especially the way that they're riding, they can have a steady hold on their bow and arrow and thus have a more accurate and steady shot. So some people would have looked at these horses and say, oh, they're small, so that's like, we always think bigger is better. But in this case, smaller and lower to the ground was a bigger advantage for the Mongols. And here's just a really cute little kid learning to shoot a bow and arrow. It said that like children were put on horses as soon as they could hold themselves up on a horse in Mongol culture. So all of that is kind of slowly leading to the Mongols to be able to take over the world, but there are other factors as well. So let's talk about those factors. So as I said, the Mongols are originally a nomadic tribe from Mongolia, which is just north of China. And they become this, powerhouse with the rise of Chinggis Khan. So you may know Chinggis Khan better as Genghis Khan, but technically the correct Latinized spelling and pronunciation is Chinggis Khan, just so you know. Chinggis Khan essentially means great leader. It's his name given to him by his people, but his birth name was Temujin. And he has so many stories and legends surrounding his life. Temujin was orphaned at a young age and was actually maimed by a rival Mongolian tribe that was attacking his family because they were kind of standing in the way of this one tribe of unifying the Mongol tribes and taking over parts of China. And there's more to the story, which we can chat about in class a little bit if you're curious. But at the end of the day, this led to Chinggis Khan being banished and actually sold off into slavery. And his whole family was either killed or also sold off into slavery. And so the story is that he did eventually make his way back to Mongolia after escaping slavery and like walking and eventually getting horse and riding his way back to Mongolia, even though he had this maimed leg. And so there are all these stories about like the revenge of Chinggis Khan. And many people believe that like the reason the Mongolian Empire was forged had to do with his exacting revenge on people who hurt him. And even though it's a really fun story, if you're kind of into that type of adventuring, most likely that is not the overarching reason why the Mongols established this gigantic empire. It definitely, I'm sure, informed some of the actions he took against some of the rival tribes amongst the Mongols. But probably the biggest reason why the Mongols took over this whole world was to secure the Silk Roads. Because as we get into the 1200s, there are a couple of groups that were destabilizing the Silk Roads. One of those groups are the Jurchen, who began to take over parts of northern China, and the other group are the Seljuks, who were starting to put pressure on the Abbasid Empire and was essentially making it really difficult to conduct safe trade on the Silk Roads. And conducting trade on the Silk Roads is very important to the nomadic people's livelihood because they couldn't grow their own foods just based on their environment. They didn't have goods to sell. So the way that the Mongols and other nomadic groups made money and were able to like make ends meet was, as I said before, by providing transportation on the Silk Roads. So long as the Silk Roads were not functioning, it was hurting the Mongols. So probably the better reason as to why the Mongols took over was to secure the Silk Roads again. That said, the Mongols were absolutely brutal. There's really no way around that. I have a very complex relationship with the Mongols. In some ways, I'm fascinated by the Mongols. I think their culture is pretty interesting, and I think the effects of the Mongol Empire are indisputably like progressive and important to the kind of general development of world history. However, they are some of the most violent and disturbing people in world history. So it's kind of a hard thing to balance. And we can really see this through some of the quotes that are attributed to Chinggis Khan. So Chinggis Khan, we know a lot of what he said because there were a lot of travelers who traveled with the Mongols because they were fascinated by them, like early journalists writing about the Mongols and taking down some of these quotations. So I just want to share some of these quotes that just show how brutal the Mongols could be. So the first is, "All who surrender will be spared. Whoever does not surrender but opposes with struggle and dissension shall be annihilated." And they really kept that promise. If you surrendered, they didn't mess with you. They incorporated you into the empire. But if you didn't, they wiped out the whole group of people. The next one is, this one's very upsetting, which I don't know why I'm trying to fancy it up with these like hearts just to kind of lighten the mood, I guess. But here Chinggis Khan says, the greatest happiness is to vanquish your enemies, to chase them before you, to rob them of their wealth, to see those dear to them bathed in tears, to clasp to your bosom their wives and daughters. Right, so pretty scary stuff. This one, the dead have risen from the grave. We must go and put them back where they belong, which Chinggis Khan apparently said in reference to a Persian king that he had conquered and then allowed to continue to rule so long as he pledged allegiance to the Mongols. But then word got out that that Persian king was discriminating against Jewish people in his community. And what we will see is that the Mongols are very intolerant of intolerance. And so the Mongols went back to wipe out that king and his followers for discriminating and persecuting Jewish people. Next quote, it is not sufficient that I succeed, all others must fail, which is pretty badass. Excuse the bell right there. And then this one, I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you. Very scary. This image is from a movie in which John Wayne, right, the famous movie star who played in Westerns, played Chinggis Khan, which is a hilarious and problematic depiction of Chinggis Khan. We'll put it there. All right, so Chinggis Khan does not actually see the extent of his empire building. This is a painting, a cave painting of the funeral of Chinggis Khan. We don't know the exact death or the reason why, that Chinggis Khan died, so we don't know cause of death, is what I should say. There are theories that it was an infection that was sustained after a battle wound. There are theories that he died of syphilis. So we don't know for sure, but we do know that when he was buried, that his casket was decorated in Islamic art, not because he converted, but because he was fascinated by Islamic art. And then his casket, after it was buried back in the Mongolian steppe, the site was obscured by dozens or hundreds of horsemen trampling over that site so that no one could ever find it. Those horsemen were then executed so the secret of the burial site of Chinggis Khan would die with them. So a lot of commitment there. They did this because Chinggis Khan essentially was considered like a living god. And they didn't want any of the enemies to dig up his body and to desecrate it in any way. So even though Chinggis Khan doesn't see the extent of his empire building, he forges this movement, which is then carried on by his descendants. So this is the extent of the conquering of the Mongol Empire over time. So we can see that they take over large swaths of China, including Korea, Central Asia, parts of the Middle East, and all the way up through parts of what is Russia and Eastern Europe today. I do want to talk about where they do not take over, because that is also significant. So they do not take over Japan, even though they try to, and I'll tell that story in just a second. They also do not take over very much of Southeast Asia because the Mongols and their horses don't do well in the rainforests in that region. They started to get sick from some of the tropical diseases there, so they turned back. They don't take over India because they forge an alliance with the Delhi Sultanate, and another reason is that it was very difficult to invade India due to the geographical boundaries such as the Himalaya Mountains. So instead, they create an alliance and then move on to conquer other territories. They also don't conquer the Arabian Peninsula because it's a desert, and it's a desert that they don't really deem very important to them. So they start to invade and then they back off. In terms of the story of Japan, the Mongols tried to take Japan, but they failed. And this is really the one time that the Mongols failed. So the Japanese take a great deal of pride in this story. And so the story is that the Mongols commandeered ships off the coast of Korea in order to then sail to Japan and to take the Japanese islands. And I don't know how many Mongols boarded the ships, but it was a decent amount. But as they were approaching the shorelines of Japan, these typhoons swept up, which is what this illustration is of, this scroll painting. You can see all these ships getting battered about in the winds. And so the winds essentially take down most of the ships, and very few Mongols make it to shore. And the Mongols that do make it to shore are wiped out by the samurai. And so this is a huge deal for Japan because they're the only ones who can say that they successfully defeated the Mongols. So that becomes a point of pride for this budding sense of Japanese nationalism. And the other thing is that this never goes away. They didn't see this as like an accident. The Japanese saw this as their gods protecting them. So the typhoons, they believed that these wind gods, known as the kazi, were protecting them. So the word for wind in Japanese is kazi. The word for the gods, the Shinto gods or spirits, is kami. So what we're talking about here are the kamikazes protected Japan, which is why the pilots in the Second World War are called the kamikaze in Japan. So little kind of fun fact stuff and a little history of Japan and the Mongols there. All right, so before we get into some of the effects of the Mongols, and before I talk about some of the like progressive reforms that they put in place, we have to grapple with the fact that the Mongols were very destructive. They killed so many people. So the Mongolian effects on demographics is a huge death toll here. So it's estimated that the Mongols killed between 15 and 40 million people, either through direct combat or due to the famines that happened after the wars. Because when you kill off a bunch of workers, like we don't have enough farmers and a lot of the land was destroyed, right? So some people starved to death after the Mongols swept through their region. So that's about 10% of the world population that were killed off by the Mongols. Another really disturbing fact is that the Mongols utilized so much sexual assault in their military strategy that it led to the fact that 10% of the men who reside within the borders of the former Mongol Empire carry Chinguskhan's Y chromosome. So what this means is that 0.5% of men in the world, or about 16 million individuals today, men, can claim descendants from Chinggis Khan. Right? That's how much he proliferated his DNA. In this one image we have here on the left, it said that Chinggis Khan had about 500 wives, because usually people would offer a royal woman to him as a wife as a way to create an alliance with Chinggis Khan. So some of this came from his wives, but some of it came through the fact that rape is used as a weapon of war. And this is not just with the Mongols. This is something that's been happening forever. But it does seem to be particularly bad when it comes to the Mongols. Right? So this is what I mean when I say the Mongols did not always treat women very well. The women within their communities were treated well, but not women that were considered enemy women. And also, just the bigger demographic effects are important to know. All right, so as I said, this is the extent of the Mongol Empire. And now what I want to talk about is after the Mongols reach their height and stop their wars, what we see is a period of time in which they enact many reforms that do have a lot of positive effects on the world, right? So it's kind of like messed up. After this era of extreme violence, we get what's called a Pax Mongolica, right? So as a reminder, historians use the term Pax to talk about a period of peace or a period of relative peace, right? So after the Mongols killed everyone, they created this very stable reign of about 100 or so years, in which there was less war and a lot of improvements to society. So this is a list of the universal policies that everyone who lived within this territory shown here took advantage of or kind of like were subjected to. So I'm going to chat about these, highlighting some of them more than others. So one of the first reforms that the Mongols enact is that they first off, they resecure the Silk Roads so that trade is possible again. And then they enact the Silk Roads as a fully free trade zone, Right? By this I mean they made it illegal to impose taxes or to do anything that would bar people from participating in trade. So due to this, people who were not actively participating in the Silk Roads can now do so, which means that more people have access to making money and not being, subjected to too much poverty. Another reform of the Mongols is that they so valued religions, education, and medicine that they made all religious, educational, and medical institutions tax exempt. Right? It was a way to show teachers and doctors and researchers and priests and imams and monks that they were a very vital part of the culture. With this, we see even more schools and hospitals are built taking advantage of this tax exemption. And everybody wins from this because with the proliferation of all these different institutions, their services will be provided to people who live in these territories. The Mongols take a census after they establish power, which is the first time we have a lot of data on how many people live throughout this region. They also institute an international postal system to try to connect their very large empire. So they would have these essentially like pony expresses send messages and goods from all the way in like China and all the way to like the Middle East. On Friday, we'll talk about how this wasn't always a good thing because it also helped to spread the plague, right, which is not good. They attempted to create a universal alphabet because they wanted to create more cohesion amongst their very different people that they had conquered. It doesn't work, but it shows that they were trying to create cohesion. Even after they had utilized a ton of torture, the Mongols abolished torture. They also campaigned to end banditry so that people could trade without fear on the Silk Roads. They also tried to end this kind of wave of terrorist assassins who were operating in parts of the Middle East to try to create more political stability. They instituted a network of diplomats to try to forge peace within their territories, and they are the first group to institute the concept of diplomatic immunity, which meant that diplomats would not be charged for like minor crimes that they commit, especially maybe if they didn't know that something was considered a crime in the area that they were serving because they're not from that area. The idea is that it creates consistency so that diplomats can focus on their work, which is creating peace between societies. The Mongols had very strict laws that mandated religious toleration. Like I said, the Mongols were very intolerant of intolerance. The Mongols essentially, while they originally were participants in what's called Mongolian shamanism, which is an animist faith, over time, many Mongols converted to different religions. So the Mongols who were in charge of the Chinese area of their empire, they often converted to Buddhism since that religion was really popular there. The Mongols who settled and worked in the Middle East and in Central Asia, many of them converted to Islam because that was the predominant religion there. So they didn't prefer or privilege any religion over others. They just in general valued religion. There's a lot of quotes where essentially the Mongolian leaders saw all religions as true, just like different windows into like the soul of God. So there's that. Probably the most significant reform that they institute is called the Resettlement Program. So what the Resettlement Program did is that they took experts from each of the regions that they conquered and resettled them in a different area with the goal of these experts teaching people how to do their area of expertise. So let me give you a couple examples here. So this is not a perfectly placed example here. So when the Mongols conquered Eastern Europe, they found out that people in Russia and what we can consider like Poland and Ukraine today, they were very good at mining. And they were kind of like the best at mining. And when they learned that, they were like, okay, Mr. Polish miner, I see you're very good at mining. So what we're going to do is I'm going to move you from your hometown that you've probably never left before. I'm going to move you all the way to China, and you're going to teach the Chinese more effective ways of mining so they can mine their various materials that they want to mine. And then would say, okay, Chinese printer who's really good at building printing presses, right? You're so good at this. What we're going to do is we're going to move you over to the Middle East, and you're going to teach the people of the Middle East, you're going to teach the Arabs how to make printing presses. And they'd say, okay, Mr. Persian doctor who's really good at eye surgery, we're going to move you to like northern, I don't know, or Central Asia and China so you can teach people how to do that type of surgery. And what's happening here is that the Mongols are pushing history forward. A lot of historians call the Mongols the makers of the modern world, because by forcing people to share this information within just like a decade, they do what probably would have taken history a couple hundred years to do. Because I'm sure at some point the Chinese would have learned the Polish methods of mining, but it just would have taken a long time as those ideas like slowly moved to China rather than the Mongols being like, boop, moving you over here. Or I'm sure eventually the Persian medical techniques would have made their way to China, but it just happened much more quickly. And the lives of everyone improved because of these policies. So this is a really big effect of the Mongols. Another example is that what they would do is kind of take two technologies from different parts of their empire and blend them. And the best example of this is when the Mongols took the concept of Chinese gunpowder and blended it with the European technology of bell casting. So the Europeans at this point were at the height of the Gothic era, and they, if you know the movie, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, or just in general, maybe know about Notre Dame. Notre Dame has these huge bell towers, or had them, and there was these huge bells that were cast, in iron and bronze and stuff like that, to make, a big sound right at the top of the church tower. And so when the Mongols learned of this, they were like, wow, bell casting is really cool. What if you took the concept of bell casting and made smaller metal forms, put gunpowder in it, and then shot at people, right? So by combining Chinese gunpowder and European bell casting, what we get is the first cannon. So again, this is the brilliance of the Mongols, that they could appreciate what everybody was doing, and through building their empire, they could blend these technologies and share these developments. So what we're going to do next, and we'll do together in class, is look at some of the more regional effects that the Mongols have on places like China and the Middle East and Russia, and kind of determine the kind of long-term and overarching effects and kind of like how we feel about the Mongols themselves. All right, that is it. Thank you for your attention.